I told you in another context that like I should almost print T-shirts that say, "Could the original audience have understood the way you're reading this text now?" Like it's almost like the IT crowd joke. Did you turn it off and back on again?
I do have a shirt that says that too.
That's almost our. Did you turn it off and back on again? Could the like. All right. Before we get too far into this interpretation of the Bible you got there, slaps the hood of this thing. We can fit so many interpretations that the original audience wouldn't have understood in this baby.
Right. And I think that also speaks to the point of why do it in apologetics, because you're going to come to any atheist who's going to say, well, that's just your interpretation. Who's to say that's the only right one? Or why don't you guys believe in mixed threads, eating shrimp, bacon, raping people, having abortions, and slavery? I mean, those are kind of the big ones that we hear nowadays. And the Christian response of, well, that was just back then. Well, everything was just back then.
It's an unhelpful response. Like there's a sense in which like there is like you have to have a helpful response. I think the big thing is that this is a helpful apologetics point, because I think a lot of unbelievers, and unfortunately correctly, believe that any Christian they're talking to is an idiot and doesn't really know their process. And maybe I'm being a little bit I exaggerate. That's what I do. So something you get used to. But like, they're going to assume that like the average evangelical hasn't really thought about, well, why do we eat shellfish? Why do we mix our fabrics? Why is it okay for us to eat pork now? And so that's why they use that argument, because usually it catches people completely flat-footed. And I think because that's part of hermeneutics. Like part of hermeneutics is there's like macro level hermeneutics, there's micro level hermeneutics. Like macro level hermeneutics would be like, how do I understand a text and where it factors into the text as a whole? And then micro level would be like, how do I deal with this one text that's in front of me? And another way of saying that is like biblical theology. It's which is kind of the discipline of keeping track of the whole story of the Bible. And that's really where those questions of like mixed fabrics and stuff come from, is like, well, first, before I can explain that, you need to understand the concept of covenant and how covenant factors into the story of the Bible. And that was old covenant. Not everything that is old covenant doesn't pass away. And that's when we're getting into systematic theology, which is how we understand how all texts fit together. And we say, now there's some old covenant texts that had to do with setting apart Israel as a nation, or Old Testament laws that had to do with setting apart Israel as a nation. And that's what mixed fabrics and shellfish and pork had to do with. But there are other laws that had to do with, we call it the moral law, which is it endures not because the Old Covenant law endures, but because it's older than the Old Covenant law. Like this is part of what has been true of God since the beginning of time. Like this is also an area of debate among some, especially in our circles, libertarian Christians, of like the question of capital punishment. Well, capital punishment, that's just an old covenant thing. Except that we see it instituted in Genesis 9, right after Noah gets off the boat. So it actually predates the Old Testament law. And so you can't just do away with it by saying, well, that's old covenant law. Well, it kind of comes before that. And also there's a debate among new covenant theologians, and I might be taking on some people. I don't know, maybe some of your fans are new covenant theology fans. So I'll just say what I say on our podcast. If you are a new covenant theology person, don't be. So, but there's a big segment of them that are like, well, the Sabbath doesn't get restated in the new covenant, therefore it's not an old covenant law that continues. Except that once again, that's something that predates the old covenant. We find it all the way back in creation, like written into creation, is the fact that one day in 7 we are to rest, and rest we don't mean just lay around, but rest in the Lord as a foreshadowing or a foretaste of our great rest that we're going to have at the end, and which is in Christ that we will have forever. And so, yeah, those are some kind of macro level hermeneutical stuff.